Hey, Larken Rose here. Time for the daily rant. So many people are clueless about even the basics of economics, even though if you just kind of look at the world in front of you and think about it for a little bit, most of the basics are really obvious. Yeah, there can be more complex, counterintuitive things involved, but mostly it's just stuff that makes sense. Economics is just kind of the study of cause and effect, mostly financial transactions, just how people behave. I wanted to talk about how government basically warps how people behave, and it makes people understand even less the sort of the nature of reality and how things would be in a free society. So let's start with the idea of, you have 100 people on an island. It's a convenient analogy to use for a lot of things. And they don't have they don't have like modern gadgets and stuff. They just have themselves and their clothes and that's it. So they're on an island and immediately the concerns are, well, water and food and shelter, maybe being rescued, but first of all, not starving to death. And so the economics of the situation is pretty simple. And what will happen is people will look for water, and if somebody finds, oh, hey, look, there's a freshwater stream, they would like tell other people, if there's enough for everybody. And if they find fruit in the trees, you mention that, and they might cooperate, like, I can't climb up there, but I found a tree, and we build a ladder, whatever people do to interact, they interact for their own benefit, but they also cooperate with others for mutual benefit. And that's just kind of the basis of economics. Plenty of people talk about the win-win thing where, if I make a deal with you that I'll help you build a shelter if you help me build a shelter, and we both end up winning because maybe neither of us could have done a good enough job by ourselves. So we work together and we both benefit and we both win from the arrangement. Whereas a win-lose would be, I'm going to chain you to this tree and make you build me a shelter, whether you want to or not. I win, you lose. And that's just the difference between voluntary cooperation and coercion. And government is always coercion, but the things that government does to mangle economics, people they don't think about it enough to realize how different so many things would be in society if not for government coercion. For example, an example I've used before is people say, well, if not for government, who would stop the drug cartels? Those, the scary Mexican drug cartels or the gangs in the U.S. and major cities who sell gangs. They would be violent and nobody would be able to keep them in check. And people rarely think about it enough to realize, wait a minute, why do those gangs exist? Why does it benefit those people to do that? They sell drugs and make a huge profit. Why do they make a huge profit? Why is Walmart not outbidding them like it does in almost everything else? It's because of the existence of government and laws that say you're not allowed to do that. So Walmart realizes, well, we can't exactly sell marijuana over the counter, well, in states where it's illegal, because the fascists come in and shut us down. And as soon as there is something that lots and lots of people want, demand in economic terms, it becomes worth a lot. So somebody's going to realize, hey, I can, even though it's illegal, I can make tons of money if I provide that. And the only reason there is that huge profit margin is because it is illegal. And you can see that in alcohol prohibition. Like the moment alcohol was illegal, it got taken over by the mafia and it got way more expensive. And, people were drinking before, during, and after prohibition, but the expense and the involved economics changed. So when people point at something like the Mexican drug cartels, what would be keeping them in check? What would be empowering them? Like there's nothing to keep in check if there's not a government creating the black markets that create the massive profits in illegal drug trade or illegal any other trade. And so they wouldn't have the money to hire mercenaries and buy guns and do that. They would just disappear just by being competed out of existence. And there's the running libertarian joke of, how often do you see shootouts between like liquor stores today? Never. It doesn't happen anymore because economically that doesn't make sense anymore. The only reason that violent, drug-related violence happens is because government makes it illegal and makes it not only outside the protection of quote-unquote law enforcement, but the target of law enforcement, who will attack people who are doing that business. So, of course, those who dare to break the law and engage in violent conflict are the ones who are going to corner the market, and the market's going to have a huge profit because of that. So that's one example, but there are a zillion others, and people just, they don't seem to notice the massive impact it can have. Use the example of it's about to be required that everyone have health insurance. Incidentally, I don't have health insurance. We haven't for ages, and we're not going to buy it because Führer Obama tells us to. Bite me, you fascist. But when you force everybody to buy a product, instantly the quality goes down and the price goes up. Just, of course, obviously. I mean, if you, again, to make a silly analogy that makes it just bleeding obvious, if you go into a store and buy groceries there, and then somebody says, now you have to go there every day, or we're going to cage you, and you have to spend at least $200. Well, the person who runs the store is suddenly going to realize, well, cool, I don't have to, like, it's not a win-win anymore. I don't have to make them win. They lose, which means I don't have to do anything. I can make the crappiest food imaginable and charge ridiculous prices for it, and they have to buy it. Yippee. And this, you can see these things, these sorts of effects whenever government nationalizes anything. Well, we're going to take over the this, that, or the other thing industry. And what happens is production goes way down because there's no need to reward the customers because government forces the customers to pay up. So the quality sucks and the price goes up, and then you get universal equal poverty all around. And it's the sad thing is when people see the results of a forced economy, of coercion mangling an economy and making it so people don't prosper and don't have extra wealth and can't afford what they want. And they look at that and they use that as an excuse for more government coercion. Because they say, well, what about the poor people? And what about the homeless? I talked before about the fact that the only reason there are homeless, except for the people who actually choose that and who want to live out there, out on the streets or whatever. The only reason there are homeless is because of government rules and regulations and laws saying where you're allowed to live, what's allowed to count as, allowed to have a resident, what's it called? Occupancy permit. Okay, now you're allowed to live there. We, the ruling class, officially declare that a human being is allowed to live in that thing. And it has to, fulfill a million different stupid little requirements. So if your choices are a house that costs $100,000 because it has to fulfill all these stupid requirements, or living on the street, a lot of people are forced to live on the street. And then people point at homelessness and go, oh, this is why we need government. No, this is why you need to not have government. Because housing and feeding the people would be ridiculously cheap and easy and simple if not for all the government regulations. And now you even have stories of people getting arrested for feeding the homeless, which is, I kind of like it when the government interference with freedom is so obvious that people point at it and go, what the heck? Like normally it's just indirect disincentives and rules and regulations and people like, I'm going to put together a charity that does this. And then people say, well, you have to do this and you have to get a permit and you have to do this. And if you want to be a 501c3, you have to do, and do all these things. And then people try and they just go, I give up. This is too much trouble. And the rest of the world never knows what would have been. They don't know the charity that would have existed if not for government rules and regulations and coercion. So they just sort of think, oh, there's all those people in need and nobody doing anything. And they don't realize that the main reason nobody is doing anything, well, people are doing something. The main reason more people aren't doing something is because the government goes out of their way to get in the way and make sure you can't. And I think it's actually convenient when government is so overtly stupid about it that they're like harassing people for feeding the homeless. Because, you know, most people look at that and go, what? You're not allowed to help the... And there's the same thing with the fascists getting in the way of, you know, when Hurricane Katrina came through and made a mess of New Orleans. And a bunch of people were going down, and FEMA stopped a bunch of shipments of people trying to take help to other people, food and supplies and whatever else. And FEMA, no, we're in charge. The main thing is that we're in charge. We don't so much care about the people who are homeless and starving in there, as long as we're in charge, and we're in charge. So here we are being in charge and stopping a bunch of people from taking stuff in. And then they also stopped trade because people were, you know, up north were saying, you know, I have a bunch of generators. People need generators down there. I'm going to go down there and I can sell them for a bunch more. And people can whine that, oh, you're being opportunistic. Well, yeah, but the people down there don't have to buy. Like if I go down there with my generator and say, normally I would sell it for 200, but so many people want it, I'm going to charge 400. And I know people down here who are going to be able to afford that. And people got arrested and prosecuted and imprisoned for trying to sell stuff to people who needed to buy the stuff and who wanted to buy the stuff. And when that sort of thing comes out and people see that and realize, wow, so the primary obstacle to people being helped in the wake of Hurricane Katrina was government. You know, and sometimes it was as direct as they just got in the way and turned people back and said, nope, you're not allowed to bring that food to the people of New Orleans. And I like it when it's that obvious, because usually government interference and coercion isn't that obvious. And as, you know, someone who, you know, my wife and I ran a medical transcription business years ago, and we got to see firsthand all the stupid things you have to do. Like, first of all, if you run your own business, if it's a little thing, there's self-employment tax, which means we, the government, are going to rob you extra for making your own job and making a job for other people, because you get double robbed if you're self-employed. And you have to fill out more forms and pay more this and, you know, do estimated payments monthly or quarterly and send in a big pile of money every month or every 3 months to the feds for the privilege of making your own job and making jobs for other people. And then people look around and go, oh, look at the jobless rate. Well, the jobless rate is that because of the government and no other reason. Because of minimum wage laws, because of self-employment taxes, because of regulations, because of all sorts of employment laws about when and how you're allowed to pay somebody to do work for you. And that coercion people don't see unless they happen to be the target of it. Like they run a business, whether it's a little business or a gigantic business, and they see all the stupid hoops they have to jump through, and they say, well, we can only hire this many people because we have to pay them this much, and we have to give them this benefit, and we have to give them paid vacations, and we have to give them this and that and the other thing, and we're not allowed to fire them for this. And so if we risk hiring people, if it's going to be hard to fire them later, you know, all these things that get in the way of people interacting voluntarily and doing the win-win thing where both sides benefit from the deal. Tons and tons and tons and tons of them every day don't happen because of the threat of government coercion, and people don't notice what didn't happen. Like they look at the numbers of the jobless. There isn't a number of how many wouldn't be jobless if not for government regulations, which is basically everybody who is jobless who actually wants to work for money. Because in a free society, it's so damn easy to find somebody who will pay something for doing some work. And it might not be you get tons and tons of money. It might be you do something simple, some manual labor, and you get paid a little bit. And, you know, like I talked about before, all the expenses of everything are mostly the result of government. Like a house doesn't need to cost $100,000. That's utterly ridiculous. If you want a fancy schmancy house with all the luxuries that a lot of people are used to, it might be that much. Although without property taxes, it would be a hell of a lot less, and without sales taxes and all sorts of other stupid taxes and regulations. But when you get coercion into the economy, which government, it's all it ever is, and people don't notice the results, and then they scream at the results, the bad results of government, and say, this is why we need government. It's so frustrating. And if you do the analogy of the island, it's really obvious. Like, let's say somebody on the island says, if anybody here builds a shelter that holds more than 2 people, I'm going to beat you up. Like, well, this is assuming other people won't just say, no, you won't, and if you try it, we'll beat the tar out of you. So let's say the biggest, toughest guy, he has a gun and nobody else does for some reason. And he says, if anybody builds a shelter that more than 2 people can sleep in, I'm going to shoot you. Instantly, you have coercion affecting the economy. And people say, well, I don't want to get shot, so I'm going to build a thing that houses 2 people, and that's it. And so you get that all over the place. And people who would have built ones that would house more just decide not to. And you never see the ones they didn't build because they didn't build them. You know, it's different than they build them and then somebody says, you have to take them down or I'm going to shoot you. No, you're not allowed to begin with. And then people go, darn, why don't we have more big huts? Well, it's because somebody threatened to kill us. And who wants to go from a 2-person hut to a 3-person hut when going to the 3-person hut means now somebody's going to threaten to kill you? And that's what laws do. You're allowed to do A, B, and C. You're not allowed to do D, E, and F. So the vast majority of people don't ever try D, E, and F because it will be against the law and they'll do nasty things to me if I even try to do that. So a massive amount of trade and productivity doesn't ever happen because of government coercion. And then we look around and say, oh, that's a shame that we don't have more of this, and that we have homeless people, and we don't have cheaper housing, and we don't have, you know, a non-fraudulent banking industry. You know, the fact that state coercion says basically you're not really allowed to compete with the dollar. You have to accept dollars. They're good for all debts, public and private. You have to accept them, and nobody else is allowed to really compete with them. And golly gee, look, the value of it is going down year after year because it's fiat garbage. And people don't notice that. And they think, so, you know, they think inflation is just some magical natural thing that happens. They don't realize it's an adverse consequence of government violence on the economy, which is making everybody poorer. And so, unfortunately, to have somebody really understand how rich a free society would be, they do have to understand a certain amount of economics and be able to imagine all the things that could have happened and would have happened if not for the constant threat of violence by government everywhere. And it's in everything. You know, it's in food, it's in transportation, it's in everything. Where if somebody says, look, I know a way to really cheaply feed lots of people, but don't make me have to label stuff. Don't threaten me with violence if I don't do it all the ways that everybody wants. And if I think my customers want it, I can say, you get to come in and see my plant where I make this food. And it's really cheap. And I can feed people for 20 cents a meal. And we do it en masse, and it'll actually even be healthier than most of what they get, but we'll do it en masse, and we won't have a $500,000 factory or a warehouse or something. We have this little shack that we do it in. And the thing is, a lot of the world does that now because they don't have regulations and stuff. And the problem is, as soon as you get prosperous enough that the parasite state can forcibly control people without killing them, you know, there's enough prosperity here that you can, the parasites can rob people and control them and regulate them, and we don't all die because we're still able to be productive. I'm pretty damn sure that if you applied all the property taxes and sales taxes and licenses and permits, and you have to get a business license to do this and that and the other thing, if you applied that to like any town in Africa, you would starve everybody there. Because the vast majority of people would be unable to comply with the laws, and they'd starve to death. Because right now, the way they collect food or produce food, oh, that's not up to FDA standards, or the EPA complaints about what you're doing to the environment, or the Food and Drug Administration says you're not allowed to do this without having a VAT license. And so people would starve. And the reason they can do it in this country is because residual freedom makes us prosperous enough that they can rob us and control us a bunch and we don't die. But people don't get the amount of extra prosperity we'd have. We'd be feeding the whole freaking world just with the leftovers we have, if not for government getting in the way in the name of compassion. So it's one of those things, a lot of times freedom is sort of obvious, and if you just think about it for 2 seconds, you understand it. But when it comes to people trying to picture a free society, they sort of assume that it would have all the drawbacks of this one and nobody to stop bad guys, which is the exact opposite. We would be so much richer, just to a ridiculous degree, because of all the things that aren't happening because of government coercion now. But the reason the government has a huge advantage is you can't see what's not happening now because it's not happening now. And so you don't see people selling, look, here's a meal for 20 cents. Although with ramen you can get close to that, but it's not exactly healthy. And so it's one of those things that government manages to make it look like it's a lot harder to feed everybody and house everybody and earn a living and stuff and survive. Makes it look like it's way harder than it really is, and then says, because it's this hard, you need us here to make sure you're taken care of. And now we need a welfare state, and we need Social Security, and we need Medicare, and we need Medicaid, and all that stuff, because people can just barely make ends meet. And the only reason anybody can just barely make ends meet is because of the giant parasite not only robbing people, but getting in the way of people being productive. And it's one of those things that actually requires more understanding and more explanation. And I don't even usually bother getting into that in public when talking to people, because those things will naturally happen when the belief in authority goes away, when people stop imagining an obligation to comply with whatever random arbitrary regulations a bunch of busybody parasites make up, and you have a free society. Most of this just seems to magically happen by itself because somebody figures out, hey, I can make a bunch of money making really cheap food to feed all the people who can't afford the expensive food. And then they do, and then that exists, and then everybody can see that it exists, but when government's around, nobody sees that it exists because they make sure it doesn't exist. So it's one of those things, just the riches and prosperity of society in the absence of government, I think would just amaze the hell out of us, which is pretty awesome considering how ridiculously prosperous we already are. The fact that people don't starve to death in this country, like unless you get lost in the wilderness, people don't starve here. Our poor, the people under the poverty line in the US are mostly overweight and have big screen TVs and houses and cars and stuff. But what we would have without the government parasite dragging a constant flow of productivity and creativity and ingenuity out of society would just be almost unimaginable. Like, I think, the thing of a 40-hour work week, people would just laugh at that and go, why would anyone need to do that just to make a living? I mean, if you really love your job, have at it. But so it's one of those things that I think that ultimately most people are going to become anarchists only when they can be shown by example, look, this is how it works. And that requires enough people to give it up and to create a free society and go, look, duh, we don't have ruling classes. We don't need them. It works just fine. And then, and only then, will most of the world go, oh, okay, that does seem to work, because they're not going to put in the effort to actually understand it ahead of time.